Thank you very much. Now to our last speaker for this morning, or for this session before we break for tea. Pat Mooney has recently retired as a co-founder and executive director of ETC Group, an international civil society organization headquartered in the Philippines and Canada that since 1977 addresses the impact of new technologies as they may or may not be relevant to the global south and marginalized peoples. ETC has observer status with many UN bodies, including FAO, UN Committee on World Food Security, the Convention on Biological Diversity, UNCTAD, UNFCCC, and IPCC. Pat Moore has honorary doctoral degrees from the universities in Canada and Mexico, and is a recipient of the Right Livelihood Award in the Swedish Parliament and the Pearson Peace Prize in Canada, as well as the Giraffe Award given to compassionate risk takers. Mr. Mooney, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to, I guess, provide the role of devil's advocate in some ways in looking at new technologies. I'd like to, I don't have a PowerPoint, no power and probably no point, actually. But so you have to look at me. But I will identify a couple of documents you can look at afterwards if you'd like to. They're freely available on the internet. One is I led a study for the International Panel of Experts in Sustainable Food Systems titled Too Big to Feed. It's also too big to read. It's fairly heavy, but it led us to, as a panel of experts on food systems, we were looking at corporate concentration in agribusiness, and our conclusion was that the major cause of it, or a major reason for concentration in the food system, is new technology. And that led us to look at those new technologies and to start to look at blockchains in particular. And that also led to a second study, which came out a few months ago, together with a number of German organizations, another program I led called, and this gives away my views, I suppose, Blocking the Chain, which looks at the implications of particularly blockchain and other big data technologies. Saying blocking the chain doesn't mean that we're against blockchains at all. It means perhaps a cautionary word that the pace of the development of blockchains worry us in the absence of a better societal understanding of what the chains may or may not do for us, worry us in the context of regulation, and who is regulating or able to understand even the technologies well enough to regulate them at this point, and the need to be aware of the side effects of any new technology, especially a technology that's going to impact our food systems. Nothing is much more close to us than that. So it's a cautionary tone that we need to look at the regulatory environment and look at the kind of side effect implications of new technologies. And that was manifest to us in our first study looking at agribusiness concentration, where we were prompted by the takeover of the largest organic food retailer in North America, Whole Foods, by Amazon. A kind of a merger you wouldn't normally have anticipated, except for because of the new big data technologies and the potential to move into markets that wouldn't have otherwise been anticipated. Perhaps it's also true for IBM Food Trust. One wouldn't have normally associated IBM directly with the food system, but obviously there are synergies there and, again, implications of all of that as well. So it's that awareness, I think, that's got us expressing some concern about how fast the technology is moving and the things that we don't know about the technologies. And they come into several areas, and I'll just identify a few quickly that worry us, that we think need to be explored further. Again, this doesn't mean that it can't be solved. It does mean it means they have to be considered. I'm surprised that so far we haven't talked about the energy costs of blockchains. And I know that varies, and I know there's changes taking place in what the cost is in terms of the energy consumption, but it still is a factor. And to be aware of then, given that energy cost, who will have access to the technologies in general, and of course always the question of who will benefit from them the most. Because there are efficiencies doesn't mean that there's equity. because there's greater speed or there are benefits accrued doesn't mean the benefits are accrued equitably, and that has to be considered. A second concern we have is again, some of the sort of implications we might not have thought of in terms of land use and land tenure being protected by blockchains. This could be very beneficial in some cases. It could also mean that suddenly peasant producers, smallholder producers around the world find that their land is up on the internet and could be bought or sold or manipulated by others in far parts of the world. Speculation on land could change, possibly because of blockchain access as well, and technologies associated, big data technologies associated with blockchains. Thirdly, of course, is the concern of how far does the chain actually go when you're dealing with a multinational enterprise who can take in wheat or rice or soybeans or corn or palm oil and may use them in any of thousands of different products. Once it's inside the company, how far does that tracking go? We now see, and we've had recent scandals here in Europe around processed foods, where highly processed foods, where infant foods that are branded the same across all of the European Union, but the actual ingredients of the same branded product in the same size are different when they're sold in Latvia as to when they're sold in Romania as to when they're sold in Germany or France. And that's still, as much as we like to think that we're eating fruits and vegetables fresh and free all the time, the reality is still that more than half of the food that people in the UK at least eat, and almost half in Germany, is highly processed foods. So is that going to be part of, can that be controlled when in those ingredients or not? Do blockchains actually, again, give a false image of equity in the system? Will they show us, as we've seen in the last couple of years here in Europe, that in fact the people picking the tomatoes in southern Italy are unregistered migrant workers who have no access to health care and sometimes even die in the field because of that? Is that evidenced through a blockchain if the information isn't provided? Is it evidenced in the blockchain if workers in vegetable picking workers in the UK are being held in slave-like conditions behind barbed wire with guard dogs, as was discovered a few months ago? Will that show up in the blockchain? Probably not, or it'll be difficult to do that. It depends upon the integrity of the company. Will the system show, for example, as we learned yesterday, that AB InBev here in Europe was falsifying prices between Belgium and the Netherlands? They were caught in doing that and are paying the price for that, but would that be manifested, that kind of dishonesty be manifested normally, or will blockchains help us manifest that contradiction? I think all of these are areas that need to be looked at and understood. We began this morning by our chair reminding us that one of the goal here is to help smallholder producers know whether or not they're getting a fair price. Well, quite honestly, producers know they're not getting a fair price. They don't need a blockchain to tell them that. Will a blockchain change it is the question. Will it actually make it a fair price in the end of the day? Will it create honor and integrity in the system to assure that it's a just and fair system? I don't think blockchains do that of themselves. It may create a level of transparency that may help to make it possible, but of itself it doesn't do that. The context, again, I think for blockchains, though, has to be widened. It's not just blockchains by themselves. It's not, and blockchains, of course, are only one part of the digital ledger technologies. It is the whole management of big data. It's digital DNA as much as it is the ones and zeros that we're used to in computer technologies. It is managing all of that. It's the Earth Bank of Codes, which propose to use blockchains as they map the genomes of everything on the planet. Understanding that is part of the process, I think, of where we're going with this. And in looking at that wider range of technologies that are part of digital information, there was, I think, a very interesting letter. I tried to find it this morning, and I couldn't find the author of it, but into the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago, proposing that we need to have an international organization on cyber security, which would, in cyber information, which would be an institution that would be created similar to the International Atomic Energy Agency. I was surprised by that, but it's an interesting concept. What's perhaps of more interest, and we've been discussing this with a number of organizations, including with UNCTAD in Geneva, is that we need to create some capacity in the United Nations system for technology assessment, which there is a modest capacity in Europe at the national level and in the European Union collectively, but is still very modest. And there is no such capacity in the United Nations system. But given the pace of technologies, given the importance of technologies, especially around digital information, we need to have something that helps us to all understand it and have confidence that the world is moving in a safe and fair direction, for an equitable direction with these technologies. It's sad for me to think, and I've been around this world for a long time in dealing with at the UN level and also with technologies. It's disappointing to me to recognize that 25 years ago, the UN did have a UN Center for Science and Technology for Development based in New York, which is a significant capacity to monitor new technologies, to advise governments on those new technologies, to suggest alternative technologies, to propose different approaches to managing the technologies. That capacity was wiped out in 1993. Equally, we used to have it in the UN Center on Corporate Concentration, it wasn't quite called that, UN Center for Transnational Corporations, pardon me. And that allowed, again, developing countries to look at who were the providers of the technologies and what were their options to look at different technologies. What kind of patent arrangements could they negotiate? Royalty arrangements could they negotiate for those technologies? That capacity also disappeared in 1993. So at the beginning of sort of the information age, the UN basically gave itself a frontal lobotomy. It would be lacking that capacity to do those. So I think I would argue, and I think many of my colleagues in civil society would argue, that as we look at these technologies, we do need to build into our intergovernmental systems a capacity to monitor those technologies, to advise on them, not to stop them, to monitor and advise, countries make their own decisions. And we need a capacity as well to be able to monitor the enterprises that are introducing those technologies to us, so we know who's doing what to who. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.